Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Chess Champions Tour, which is being held online by chess.com. Now, it's a very prestigious event. So far, we've had 4 events which have comprised the Chess Champions Tour. We've had multiple winners. We had Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion, winning events number 1 and number 4. We had Hikaru Nakamura, the famous streamer, winning event number 2, and Norbek Abdusatorov winning event number 3. So it's been a pretty hype event. We've had a little bit of a break from it. We've had a lot of over-the-board chess. And now that online chess is back, we do have Magnus Carlsen himself returning to play in the Champions Chess Tour, which, as I mentioned, he has dominated, having won 2 out of the 4 events. So let's jump right into the action. So here we go. So we have Magnus Carlsen playing the first match against Amin Tabatabaei from Iran. If I mispronounced it, I do apologize, you guys. At any rate, the format is pretty straightforward. It is a double elimination event, so you do have to lose 2 matches to be knocked out, unlike the FIDE World Cup where you only had to lose 1 match. However, the players play 4-game matches instead of 2-game matches. So the format is 4 games, 15 minutes plus 10-second increment. If the match is tied 2-2, they play the classic Armageddon game. So Magnus returning to online chess, and we're going to start by taking a look at the very first game of this match. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire game because we have a lot of exciting games to get to in this recap, and it would simply take too long, but we will take a look at this opening. So we get e4 from Magnus. Amin plays e5, knight f3, knight c6. We get bishop to b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6 castle, knight takes e4 and d4. Now this is the classic open Spanish where black tries to grab this pawn on e4. It's a temporary sacrifice by white, but white almost always gets the pawn back on the next couple of turns. So we get b5, bishop b3, d5 takes, bishop e6, and bishop e3. Now, I've told this story many times, but the open Spanish, one of the first memories I have of seeing this was all the way back in the year 1995. Now, that is nearly 30 years ago, in fact. I'm not sure when Game 10 of the World Championship match was played. It could have been almost exactly 28 years ago to the day, since I know the match was in August and September. But one of my best experiences that I look back on very fondly was the World Chess Championship match in 1995 held between Garry Kasparov from Russia and Vishwanathan Anand from India. Now, that match was played at the World Trade Center, now the former World Trade Center in New York City. I did go to game number 10, and they played this. Now, much like a lot of the World Championship matches in recent history, the first 8 games of that match were drawn, which at the time was unheard of. Anand won a very nice game in the 9th game, but in the 10th game, Garry struck back with the white piece in the open Spanish to win and even up the match at 5-5. So, a lot of history to this opening. However, what I saw today in this opening from Magnus is something that I have never seen before. So we get bishop to e3. Amin plays bishop e7, we get c3, castles, knight bd2, and now we have this move bishop g4, and Magnus plays this very interesting move, pawn to h3. Now, when Magnus plays h3, Amin says, okay, I'm just going to take your knight on d2, and if you capture the bishop, I can simply take, and after queen f3, knight takes e5. If you were to take this pawn on d5, black is actually, I think, completely winning here after rook a d8, because you will lose one of these 2 bishops on either d5 or d2. And for example, if you play the move queen takes d2, which is another option, after takes knight e5, once again, black is in great shape due to these double pawns on f2 and f3. So, rather shockingly, Magnus sacks the rook with h takes g4, and Amin gladly grabs the rook, and now Magnus plays this move queen f1. Now, there are a couple of interesting things to this. First of all, I've never seen this exchange sacrifice. I don't know if Magnus mentioned this in the post-match interview in terms of whether it was deep preparation, something that he came up with last night, or maybe he just played it over the board as some kind of basic inspired idea. Now, after knight takes f1, Magnus plays this move queen f1. Unfortunately, we only have the weak chess.com engine to use in terms of the valuation and the bar and what it says. So we don't know how strong this idea was from Magnus here. But even on the weak computer, it thinks that queen takes f1 is a mistake, and it prefers to move king takes f1. And after knight a5, bishop takes d5, white has a bishop and a pawn for the rook, as well as the 2 bishops, and white probably has enough compensation to at least equalize. But Magnus plays queen f1 instantly. We get knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4. All these moves come in instantly from Magnus up until this point. So up until this point, when g6 is played, all of Magnus's moves were instant. Now, what's interesting about that is the fact that the computer actually really does not like white's position, or at least the weak engine does not like does not like white's position. If we had the sets of supercomputer in Norway, which was analyzing, maybe we would have a clearer picture of whether this was really all that bad for white or not. But the weak engine does not agree. And it's also noteworthy that as move G6 on the weak engine is the top move, and this is where Magnus spends 6 minutes before playing his next move, whereas up to this point, every move he played was pretty much instant. So it's kind of unusual that G6 is where it ends, since that is the top computer move, but Magnus uses a lot of time, plays rook E1. Now, computer thinks that he's much worse here. He thinks about 0.7, 0.8, at least on the weak engine. On a strong computer, we have no idea what the true evaluation is, but at least on the weak one, that's what it thinks. So we get bishop h6, knight e5. Now, all these moves from here on are pretty, I wouldn't say straightforward, but the moves make a lot of sense. I don't want to spend too long going over this game because we have some more exciting games to cover. But nonetheless, a very interesting opening. Also interesting that queen takes e6 is apparently a double X-slam move from Amin, just sacrificing the rook on f8. So you get f4 here played by Magnus. We get rook f7, takes queen e2. And now after e4, we reach a very common theme in the open Spanish, which is black gets a rook for a bishop and a knight, but in return, he also gets a big black center. Now, for those of you guys who watched the candidates last year where I played in the event, I did a recap of my game against Fabiano Caruana in the Open Spanish, a game that I won, a very big victory for me. And that game had the same characteristics where Fabiano got a big black center. I may put a link to the recap of that video after I post it on YouTube. At any rate, that game had similar characteristics. And there are a lot of situations where black does get this rook for the bishop and the knight. And in return, you get the big black center. So the game would go on. We got king g2, queen e5, queen e3, rook e8, bishop f4. Amin again sacrificed the rook for a second time on f4. And at this point, it looks like black is doing very well. However, white does have an extra knight on the board in return for all these pawns. That being said, if white were to play knight e3 after c6, this pawn center is super solid, which is why Magnus goes knight g3, understanding that here you can reroute the knight towards this d4 square where it can't easily be kicked away. Because if you play c5 to stop knight to d4, then the pawn on d5 becomes very brittle here, and black is actually in a little bit of trouble. So we get king f6, knight e2, bishop d6, rook f1, king g5, bishop b3, c6, now knight to d4. Nice bastion here, trying to weaken this chain of pawns in the center of the board. Amin goes c5, we get knight e2, c4, bishop d1, rook f8, and now after we trade a knight to d4 here, apparently black is winning after this very odd move, king to f4, which of course no human would play in a blitz game because it looks like you're walking into the classic fork with knight to e6 hitting the king and the bishop. After king e5, knight f8, white has an extra knight, extra bishop, down 2 pieces, of course you resign. But after knight e6, you can sneak in with the king, with king to e3, and after knight takes f8, king d2, your bishop on d1 is actually trapped. You simply have no squares available for it here, and you'll lose the bishop, and you'll actually lose the game here, because after bishop f3 takes, and king c2, suddenly the black king is here gobbling all the pawns as though this is a game of Pac-Man. So a big miss here by Amin, but again, Amin very low on time in this position here. Let's just get right back. In this position, Amin very low on time, down to a minute 28, and it looks like you're just walking into the fork, and you obviously spot knight to e6 in this position. So we got bishop d6, a4, b4, and eventually the game starts to peter out towards a draw. We get this endgame here just to illustrate what happens, where eventually Amin is able to get the 3 wide peepos, the C, the E, and the H pawns. But due to the opposite color bishops here, Magnus is actually able to set up a fortress, even though he himself doesn't believe in that. So we get knight to e1, bishop d4, knight d3, king g3, king e2, h4, knight to e1 here, and after bishop c5, knight c2, king f4, and bishop d5, white has now set up a fortress where basically the king on g3 can never get in this position. You can never get in. If I play bishop c6, king h2, I can always go king f1. No king g1 is playable here. So you can't really get in with the king on this side of the board. And if you try to bring the king back around, even here, you still can't get in. Even if you get to this position here, for example, where you get h3, h2, bishop g2, the king covers the c4 square, the knight covers b4 and d4, bishop on g2 covers d5, a4 covers b5, and because this king cannot get in, the position is a draw. So the game does end peacefully after a couple of more moves. We got a very similar system, or setup, I should say, where Magnus just keeps moving the knight, the bishop, and the king. And eventually the game does end in a draw here. We get knight e1, knight c2, and Amin simply can't make any progress here despite having the 3 white pipos because of the opposite color bishops and this nice little fortress with the knight and the king that always stops the black king from entering on either the king side or the queen side. So game number 1 ends in a draw. Not too surprising in terms of result, but definitely a very inspired opening idea, and I would say this is something that players like Anish Giri, the famous grandmaster from the Netherlands, or Fabiano Caruana, they will be studying this line very hard tonight. They'll probably be spending an hour, 2 hours looking at with their supercomputers and trying to figure out whether Magnus' idea is worth playing in a classical game or whether it is complete nonsense. So let's move to the second game. Now, in the second game of the match, Amin has the white pieces. We're tied 1 draw, so it's half-half as we move forward. So Amin plays c4, we get g6, knight to c3, c5, and this is the classic symmetrical English. Obviously, the name needs no explanation because white has played c4, black has played c5, and it's like the classic mirror, mirror on the wall. So we have the symmetry or the mirror with c4 to c5, and that's why it's called the symmetrical English. So we get g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, knight c6, and now we get d3 here. Now, in the famed Canada's tournament in 2016, there was this famous American grandmaster at the time and top player Hikaru, who actually had a very similar position where he played e3 and knight g to e2. It might have even been without knight c3 against Fabiano Caruana in round 1 of the 2016 Canada's. Hikaru actually did get a position that was winning. Unfortunately, there's no recap because he wasn't streaming and doing recaps at the time. But e3 is one way to play with knight e2 and d4 here. Amin instead plays d3. We get knight to h6 here from Magnus, and this is a slight deviation. Now, you probably have noticed I'm talking about this guy Hikaru a lot because Hikaru's games are pretty well known, and we might as well talk about them. Now, I don't remember the exact game where this happened, but somewhere around the year 2010 or 2011, there was a Blitz tournament in conjunction with the Town Memorial where Hikaru played against Magnus Carlsen himself with the white pieces, and it was very similar where Magnus at some point played something like takes, queen d7, e3, and f5. Now, I don't remember the exact game. I was looking for it before I started recording this video. I couldn't find it. If there are internet sleuths out there who are able to find the game in the symmetrical English, please do post a comment on this video with a link to the game, because I'm sure it's on Chess Games or one of those sites. At any rate, Magnus does not play the traditional d6. He plays knight to h6, basically trying to bring the knight to the center of the board via f5 and then d4 down the road. So Amin here plays h4, very aggressive move in the spirit of AlphaZero. All the top computers these days, they love to push p on the edge of the board. So you get b6, h5, bishop b7, bishop f4, and now Magnus tries to bring the knight to the center of the board for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a big headache with the bishop on f4 targeting the knight on h6. Additionally, you can never castle because after takes, suddenly your knight on h6 is going to collapse. You will lose the knight, and if you move the knight, you're now simply down 2 pawns on the king side. So Magnus plays this move. Magnus plays this move, knight to f5, trying to bring the knight to the center. It's worth pointing out that Magnus also could have tried to develop the bishop with d6, activating it on this diagonal on either f5 or g4, but it's really not all that great, because if you ever go bishop f5, there are always ideas like e4 to target the bishop. If you ever go to g4, I can also play f3, and your bishop has to move away. If you capture on h5, there's g4, trapping the bishop. So that's why Magnus goes for the double fianchetto here. He also wants to oppose the bishop on this long diagonal. So in this position, we get h6 here from Amin, and now Magnus takes on c3. He could have maybe played bishop f6 here or bishop d4, but the bishop is looking very, very iffy on either of these squares. So we get takes, and now f6 is played by Magnus. And you're probably thinking to yourself, if you're a newer player of the game, what is going on here? Magnus is playing all these moves that violate all the rules that either Hikaru or Levy have told me you can play, or you can do. Now, the reason for that is pretty straightforward. As you get higher and higher at chess, you learn 1,000 rules, and you learn when you can break every single one of them. And this is an example of Magnus basically showing why he's a professional chess player, and you at home are not the professional chess player, even if you are aspiring to get to that level. So first of all, Magnus has violated one of the basic rules. When you fianchetto the bishop, you do not want to trade this bishop. Now there are going to be weaknesses, and you're probably going to get a lolly checkmate on the g7 square with his pawn holding the queen down the road. Violation number 1. Now Magnus plays f6, which, as you know, this is, of course, violation number 2. As Grandmaster Benjamin Feingold always says, you do not push your f-pawn. Never push your f-pawn. But Magnus has pushed the f-pawn before even castling, which is a further violation, because if you were to say castle and then play something like f6, it might still be bad, but at least your king is out of the center of the board. So Magnus has committed many violations so far in this game. but the computer still does not think it's actually all that bad. So we get e4 from Amin, and on that note, since I said computer doesn't consider it that bad, this is one of the very important factors in chess and how the game has changed with technology, is that if something is not outright losing, you can almost play anything, because even though the computer gives us the 0.68, we know that Amin and Magnus are not supercomputers. They cannot play at a 3500 level. So if it's only slightly worse, you can almost play anything in this day and age. So we get e4 knight d6. Secondarily, however, I do have to add the caveat that when you do try to play like this, you also have to take into account how strong your opponent is. And I do not think Magnus would take such liberties if he were playing the former contender for the World Championship, Fabiano Caruana, because I think he would figure his position is a little bit too dubious. But again, you never know. We might get that matchup, and maybe Magnus will watch this video and he'll be like, okay, I want to prove a point. Hikaru doesn't know what he's talking about, and he'll play like this anyway. So we get e4 knight d6. Amin trades the bishop for the knight and goes knight h3. Now Magnus has a very weird pawn structure with these double pawns on d6 and d5, but at least the bishop is on the opposite diagonal. For example, if you have this bishop on c8 here, and you, I can't actually put the pawn back, so I'll just put a rook on b7 to illustrate the point. If you don't have this diagonal available, it's actually almost impossible to activate the bishop, because the only way to open up the diagonal is to push a pawn here and then try to go d6 and activate the bishop. But you can't really activate on this diagonal. If you don't have access to this diagonal, the bishop is actually a really, really bad piece on c8 here. However, as always, Magnus has the bishop on the right diagonal, so even though he has these double pawns, he can always move the knight to the center of the board down the road, play something like knight e5, and then try to open up the scope with f5 and put massive pressure on the pawn on e4. So in this position, Magnus does in fact play knight to e5. We get knight to f4 from Amin. Magnus plays queen e7. Now here, Magnus is keeping both options available of castling either kingside or queenside. And this is a bit of a poker situation where it's going to be on white to castle the king, and whichever way white castles the king, Magnus will probably castle the same way. So Amin decides to break the tension and castle here rather than trying to wait it out. The reason that I say this is if white were to play queen e2 here, for example, if Magnus were to castle queenside here, white can now go a4 and a5 and attack on the a file. Just a sample line, something like king c7, castles king c8, a5, king c7, and rook b1. And suddenly out of nowhere, you're getting crushed on the queen side here by the queen and the two rooks here, and it's a complete disaster, and you will resign in a couple of moves. So when Amin castles kingside, now Magnus realizes, okay, well, obviously I'm not going to castle queenside into the big attack on the queenside, but now that you've castled kingside, I can also castle kingside. Whereas if Amin had played something like queen e2 and Magnus were to castle here, maybe down the road there's something like knight d5, maybe f4, maybe something like even g4, g5, and white can try to push p on the kingside here and be very aggressive. But once Amin castles kingside and Magnus castles, now both sides have castled. There isn't going to be any raging attack. Sure, white can still play a4, a5, but with king all the way over here, it doesn't mean anything. Now, another important concept that we've learned with computers is pushing a pawn to h5 or h6 very early on the same side that you castle. Now, I'm not a computer, so I can't really explain this in human terms, but we're never really sure whether a pawn on h6 here relative to h7 and g6, whether it is a strength or a weakness. Now, there are a couple of games that come to my mind where it's turned out to be a very big strength. There was a game where I played against Alexander Grishuk from the candidates, or not from the candidates, sorry, from the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin in 2022. I might link this in the description below because I did do a recap of that game where I did push a pawn to h6 very early, and it worked out quite well. Another game, also from the FIDE Grand Prix, is where I played against Grigori Oparin, and he had the white pieces and kings in it, and he also pushed a pawn to h6 in a very similar situation. So you're never really sure whether it's a strength or whether it's a weakness. Now, to my untrained eye, it actually looks like it's a serious weakness here because black can go knight f7 and try to win the pawn right away. So we get rook to e1 played here by Amin. Magnus goes rook e8. Another thing to point out is when you look at the time usage, Amin is struggling a lot. In all these games, he is way down on time. He's just so far down on time. Magnus really trying to put pressure on his clock. He's down 6 minutes here, and you have a feeling that even though white is still better, there are no obvious moves while Magnus basically has to react. Does Amin try to attack on the queen side? If not, you can play f5, you can go knight f7. All of Magnus's moves here pretty much flow together. So we do get a4, Magnus plays queen d8, and now we get this move a5, which is extremely committal, but because Amin doesn't have a lot of time on the clock, he has to come up with a plan. You cannot freeze, because if you freeze here without an obvious plan, Magnus is just going to play moves very quickly here. For example, if you play a move like queen d2, black can maybe go f5 here, trying to open up the diagonal. Let's just say you go a5 here, for example. There's queen g5 maybe. You can maybe even take and play something like g5 and knight f3, and it's just extremely hard to play for the player with the white pieces. So Amin decides, you know what, I'm low on time. I got to go for the obvious plan with the a5, but there is a serious drawback to this idea. So after takes, we get d4, knight f7. Magnus does not capture on c4 because there's queen b3 attacking the bishop as well as pinning the knight on c4. And after bishop a6, bishop f1, white is simply winning the game here. You could play d5, but after knight d5, how do you guard either the knight on c4 or the bishop on a6? You really can't in this situation. So we get knight f7 played here by Magnus. Amin plays queen a4, and now we get knight h6, takes, and now a6. Now, the drawback to playing a4, a5, as we're starting to see, is that black has his pawn on the edge of the board, which he can potentially push down the board in the next couple of moves. So we get knight d5, king g7 played here to guard the pawn on f6. We get rook b1 from Amin, logical move because here the e file is closed and you can't really use it. So you might as well try to use the open b file as well as the a file. Magnus goes rook b8, no pressure anymore on e4. Might as well try to contest this b file. We get the move takes, rook c5. Magnus plays knight f7. Here, Amin plays f4. And now we get knight to d6 from Magnus, trying to put pressure on the pawns on e4 and c4. We get rook c7 played, bishop to c6. And now Amin plays this move, rook takes b8. Now, this is the start of going wrong, but one of the big problems here is the clock is a big issue. But then secondarily, Magnus Carlsen is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, endgame player of all time. And we're trending in that direction. And you have this very annoying passed pawn that's going to start pushing down the board. Computer thinks that after rook b6 takes with pressure on the d7 pawn, white is still probably okay, but it feels difficult to play. So we get takes, and now Amin plays the move knight takes f6, and this is a fairly severe mistake here, because even though Amin sees king f6, e5, forking the king and the knight here, in this position, Magnus does not have to eat the knight. Instead, he can play check, king h2, and now this nasty move, rook b7, forcing the rook off the board. You can't move up without the rook being captured. And after takes, now black, even though he's down a pawn, has this very outside pawn on the a file. It's simply going to roll down the board pretty much unchecked. So we get e5, a5, knight d5, a4, knight b4, a3. And here we got bishop takes bishop. If Amin were to say play bishop d5, for example, black does not have to undouble the pawns and give white these 5 connected pawns in the center. Instead, you can simply play something like knight c5. Let's just say you go king g2. And now after something like bishop a4 and bishop b3, followed by a2, black will win the game. So we get takes, king g2. Magnus plays knight c5. Amin plays king f3, desperately trying to get his king over to win this pawn on a3, because the pawn on a3 basically means your knight is stuck stopping the pawn from pushing, so you can never activate the knight towards the center of the board. So here Magnus plays h5. Amin goes king e3, and now we get king f7, knight to a2 played. Now, computer thinks after king d4, it's not necessarily losing on the spot, but after knight e6, king d3, and something like knight g7 here with the idea, actually not knight g7, sorry, c5 first, knight a2, and then knight g7 with the idea of knight f5 and knight g3, it feels very, very hard to play. Computer actually thinks after king e4, knight f5, king f3, apparently this is not losing, but I think in human practice, it would be borderline impossible to save, considering the time situation. First of all, your pawn on g3 is weak. If you ever go g4, for example, let's just say king g7 and g4, black can trade, go knight e3, and win the pawn on c4, and it feels very dangerous. So at this point, we get h5, we get king e3, Magnus goes king f7, and we get knight a2. Again, like I said, king d4 could have been played. A computer might have saved the game, but for us mere humans, not realistic. So after knight e2, Magnus plays knight e6, king to e4, he goes knight g7 here, intending to play for knight f5. We get pawn to c5 here. Now, this is just a blunder, but already here, computer thinks that after knight b4, there's this very nasty move g5 here, and black is probably winning. So you get c5, and Magnus does not hesitate to play g5 now, showing why he is so good at endgames, because if you play the move f5, black can now play h4, and after takes, once again, we have the wide p-post, but they're split super, super wide here. You have the a pawn and the h pawn on the furthest edges of the board here, and you pretty much can't stop both pawns. After f6, knight e6, king f3, going after this pawn, black can play knight g5, and after king g4, there's h3, king g3, and king e6. And here white effectively is lost because after a move like knight b4, black can take the pawn, knight covers on f7, and black will simply run this king straight down to e4, e3, d2, c1, b2, push the pawn to a2, and win this knight on b4. So after g5, Amin plays the move f takes g5 with 5 seconds on the clock, but it's all for naught. We get king g6, king d4, now knight to f5 check, king c4 takes, knight to b4 is played, Magnus plays h4, and again, the pipos are just so strong since they're split so wide. Here we get king b3, h3, knight d3, h2, we get knight to f2, desperately trying to get the knight back, and now Magnus plays another nasty move, knight to e4, attacking the knight on f2. You cannot capture because then black gets a queen, and after knight h1, the game concludes with takes, king a3, king f5, king b4 takes, king a5, knight takes c5, king b6, king d6, and as you see, this knight here is stuck on the edge of the board, simply out of play, and even though white's only down a pawn, the endgame is lost. It concludes with knight f2, check, king a5 takes, king b4, knight e2, knight h1, king d5, king b3, king e4, king c2, we get king f3, king d2, and knight g3. And now the knight is stuck here. You can't go to f2. If you trade, black will just queen. And if you don't trade, I will simply take the knight, move the knight back, make a queen, and win the game. So very tough situation here. Amin loses the second game. He's now down 1.5-half. And we move to the third game where Magnus is playing with the white pieces. So Magnus up 1.5-half. He decides again to play the Spanish opening with bishop b5. We got a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and now Magnus decides to play this move d3, which is known as a closed Spanish. Basically, the reason it's called the closed, it guards the pawn, but it stops black from taking, and now it's going to be a very slow positional game, which is exactly what Magnus loves to play. So we get bishop c5, we get c3, b5, bishop b3 played here, d6, bishop g5 here, h6, bishop h4, bishop b6, knight bd2, g5, bishop g3, and now let's move queen e7. Now this position is very similar to a lot of the Italians, or the Gucci pianos as we like to call them, where white puts a bishop on h4 and g3 while having a bishop on b3 or c2. In general, the pawn structure is always the same with these 4 pawns, but it's more about the placement of these bishops. So after queen e7, we get a4 here. Magnus does not castle right away because after castling, you're inviting black to go for a massive attack with a move like h5. Now in this position after h4, white is actually doing quite well, but you're always very worried, say something like even knight h7, something like rook c1, and then h5, h4. And again, after h4, bishop g4, it feels really scary. There are even moves like rook g8 to play on the g file here, and it just feels like white's in a lot of trouble. That being said, computers generally like these positions for white. They feel that it's actually better, but in human practice, it's very hard to play. So we get this move a4, rook b8, takes. Now Magnus has the open a file for the rook, which probably will come in handy down the road. Now Magnus plays knight f1, still delaying the decision to castle here. We get bishop e6, knight e3, takes, castles, and now white has the bishop pair, and additionally, there's some problems on the f file because these pawns are on e5 and g5, so if white can ever get a knight to this f5 square, white will almost simply win the game on the spot. So Amin plays rook a8 here. We get the trade of rooks. Amin trying to argue that by trading more pieces off the board, now even though he's a bad pawn structure, it should be relatively playable. So we get knight to h4 here from Magnus, which is the start of the end. Knight h4 is a fantastic move here. Magnus sacks the knight here. If Amin were to take, now you're going to lose this knight on f6 due to the pin, or you'll lose the queen. Move the knight, there goes the queen, GG, why not? And if you don't move the knight, I mean, there's no way really to guard it. King g7 is possible, but after takes, queen h5, for example, white is simply winning here because the queen is much more powerful than the rook and the knight. So knight h4 is a fantastic move by Magnus because now he's also aiming to put this knight on f5. And if the knight ever gets to f5, even if black gets something like this, for example, now with this great bishop on b3 that's unopposed and the pressure here, h4 coming in, it's totally hopeless for the player with the black pieces. So after knight h4, Amin plays bishop g4. Amazingly, computer still thinks that this is not lost, though, as you can see from the bar. We get queen to e1, knight to a5, and now Magnus plays bishop d1, trying to trade off the light square bishops so he can put this knight on f5. And here, Amin essentially blunders the game with bishop takes d1 because now Magnus gets his knight on f5, and as we know from the famous former world champion Garry Kasparov, a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, and here it's worth even more. Because after queen e6, queen takes d1, the knight is now a bastion on top of that. You have all these weaknesses on the king side. And already here, I would say it looks completely hopeless. I don't think even Magnus himself would be able to save this game with the black pieces. In this position, after bishop d1, what Amin should have played was bishop d7. And after knight f5 takes. Yes, white is quite a bit better here after knight c6, h4. But maybe after knight d7, you can still hope to survive somehow because of bishop b3. You can play knight to d8 and maybe knight e6 and hold your pawns here. And the bishop on g3 is actually not a great piece because it's staring at a pawn wall and it can't really go to h4. If you could magically say, let me try to illustrate this somehow. If you could somehow magically get the bishop to e3, for example, the bishop would be doing a lot of damage on this diagonal. But in this position, as we look right here, for example, the pawn on e3 actually stops you from ever putting the bishop on that diagonal. And so the bishop on g3 is not all that great, so black has some hope. But after takes, knight f5, queen e6, queen d1, we get king h7, Magnus plays h4, which apparently is a blunder because here there's this tricky move knight to b3, completely ignoring everything on the king side here. And after a move like queen to f3, or not queen f3, sorry, because queen f3 would lose to knight d2 with the fork. But after a move like queen to e2, for example, black can maybe even go rook to a1, forcing the rooks off the board. And once again, with one less piece, even after takes, there are no threats on g4, h5 because the knight simply covers a square and maybe black can survive. But knight b3 is a very difficult move to play here because it's just ignoring the raging storm towards your king on h7, and it's just not logical. Maybe if you have 30 minutes, you can play this move, but with 8 minutes, nobody's going to play it. So we get rook g8 here, and now after takes, we get rook takes g5. Amin still probably should have taken with the pawn, but it feels very scary because even a move like king f2 with the idea of rook to h1, and it looks like your king is getting checkmated on the h file. So we get rook g5, Magnus now gets bishop h4. Now the bishop is actually really well placed on h4, and white has achieved perfect harmony. You have the bastion on f5, the bishop is great on this diagonal, pressure on the f file, and all of white's pieces are doing wonders here. So we get b4, knight c6, queen to f3 here, and now you've got the double stack on the f file. The bishop is putting pressure on the knight. You have the bastion on f5 as well, and it's just too difficult to defend. And Amin goes down in flames here. He plays knight to g8. Now Magnus plays d4, create the big white center. Idea of d5, forking the queen and the knight. And there's just nothing black can do. Amin trades the pawns, undoubles the double pawns, and now white is complete control. Knight is passive, bishop is good on this diagonal, and Amin plays a move queen c4 here. Magnus plays knight g3, putting pressure on f7 while guarding the pawn on e4. We get f6 played here. Magnus goes knight to h5, rerouting the knight, and now you can't guard the pawn on f6 anymore. Amin plays queen f7. We get e5 here, another very difficult move to deal with because now you also create a fossil, all the while putting even more pressure on this pawn on f6. Amin goes knight e7. Magnus plays e6. Amin kind of has to take the pawn. If you were to play queen e8, for example, after bishop takes f6, white is up a pawn. Inevitably, there's going to be a check on f7. Say you go queen c6, for example, takes, knight e7, and rook f7 would win the game with the classic kebab. So we get queen e6, knight f4 here, forking the queen and the rook. We get queen f7, takes, queen d3, and the rest is pretty basic here from Magnus. Not a whole lot of technique needed here. He takes the pawn on b5. We get knight g6, queen h5, queen c4, rook f3, activating the rook to pin the knight here and create more problems. Maybe even rook h3 to pressure the pawn on h6 as well. We get queen e2, king h2 played here by Magnus, just a quiet move to dodge any tricks. We get queen e4, bishop to f2, not hanging the bishop on the h4 square. We get knight g7, rook e3, queen f4, king g1, c6, we get c4, d5 here, not queen takes d4, because after queen d4, rook takes f7 would be the clean fossil, knight takes rook, bishop takes queen. So we get d5, c5, knight f5 played here, rook f3, queen c1, king h2, and now after knight e7 and bishop to e3, Amin resigns the game here, and Magnus wins this match. The reason Amin resigns, if you move the queen, I can just take the pawn. After king f7, bishop g5, you're probably going to lose the pawn on f6. The white king is super safe here on h2. No checks for black with the queen, and a player of Magnus's caliber will never mess this up. So Amin resigns the game after the move bishop to e3. Magnus wins the match by a score of 2.5 to half. He moves on to the next round. I'm not actually sure who he's going to play yet since this match was only 3 games. But at any rate, a very, very impressive result from Magnus. Once again, he shows how good he is. He just dominates. First game was a little bit choppy, back and forth, but the quality of Magnus' play in the second and the third game was simply too high. And even beyond that, it shows once again why so many players are rightfully afraid of playing against Magnus in endgames, because his precision and technique is just that good. So at any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the first round of the Champions Chess Tour, which is being played on chess.com. I will be back maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do a recap because I'm going to Disney World. I'm going to have a day off, enjoy my vacation a little bit. But at any rate, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. If I don't do a recap tomorrow, I'll be back with a recap after the third round, which I think will be the semifinals, if I'm not mistaken, of this Julius Baer Generations Cup, which is part of the Champions Chess Tour. So once again, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps and YouTube-only content in the near future. See you guys. Bye.